We're back. One of the first signs of what would become the new conservatism, at least in electoral politics, was the campaign of Barry Goldwater, the Republican nominee for president in 1964, running against Lyndon B. Johnson. We already know, hopefully, something about. Johnson was running to become president in his own right for the first time, since we know also that he'd become president only because President Kennedy was assassinated and he had been his vice president. So this is the election where in which Lyndon Johnson became president in his own right. So we should already know then that Goldwater lost. But it was surprising to a lot of Americans, both Republican and Democrats, that this guy got nominated at all, because he was an extreme version of conservative Republican. He said at one point in his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention in this year, "I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is not virtue." So that statement doesn't even sound that extreme today, but it certainly was at the time. But maybe a bigger sign of the new conservatism to come, again, this was still in the future, meaning it wasn't clear at this time that it was these events, these two gentlemen would be involved, or at least be seen as being involved in laying the groundwork for the new conservatism or grassroots conservatism. But Ronald Reagan's speech at the Republican National Convention of the same year, he was endorsing the candidacy of Goldwater, but in some ways this is kind of the coming out party for Ronald Reagan himself, who was a governor of California after being a fairly successful movie star, famous face and name because of that. But he had been doing some television work as a spokesman for General Electric, a major corporate presence in America, in the economy. And in the process, he'd become a staunch conservative and switched parties from the Democratic Party. He'd been an early admirer of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal, but his politics and political views changed considerably right in this period. But he was becoming a political star here, that being asked to speak at the Republican National Convention is a sign of that. His speech, "A Time for Choosing," in a way stole the show. He wasn't running, he was supporting Goldwater, who you see on the left, but Reagan's speech in some ways caught fire and caught the conservatives' imagination, both then and in later years. Again, Goldwater lost the election, but this is still a sign of things to come. Which brings us then to the rise and fall of Richard Nixon. And remember, Nixon was not really a conservative in the same mold that I've been kind of prepping you for. Not a new conservative, but I did say that he sort of saw it coming, and he appealed to some of those disparate conservative elements in trying to get votes and achieve support. So he understood that there was sort of this growing reservoir of more traditional conservatism, the libertarian strand of it, but he didn't. He wasn't actually of that persuasion himself. Stephen Knott, in a great book that I've quoted in other units called "The Lost Soul of the American Presidency," recent book, says Nixon's warning that the nation suffered from inflated rhetoric that promises more than it can deliver was an appropriate diagnosis of what ailed the modern presidency. Unfortunately, Nixon went on to commit his administration to goals as unattainable as his progressive predecessors, including declaring war on drugs. And perhaps more than any president since Andrew Johnson, the guy that succeeded Abraham Lincoln, and was none too popular and none too successful, Nixon demonstrated a little regard for the rule of law, considered his opponents to be enemies, and drew no distinction between himself and the office of president. He devoted you should go back and unpack that statement because there's a lot there in that one sentence. He devoted a remarkable amount of energy plotting how to screw his enemies and slighted the role of head of state in favor of a highly partisan presidency. Sliding the role of head of state means that, at least the professor here not, is saying he didn't do part of the president's job, which is to unify the country, to use his presence and his public speaking stature. The president has a bully pulpit, as Theodore Roosevelt once said, unlike any other. I mentioned that in the earlier lecture when we got to John F. Kennedy, that the president has a unique place really in the world, because when the president of the United States speaks, the world listens. So he didn't use that platform, that bully pulpit, really in a way to unite, and sometimes didn't really use it at all. And so Stephen Knott here is giving him a major demerit as president for not playing kind of the head of state role, the guy that's supposed to be kind of the face of the country, guiding it, unifying it, sort of setting the tone for what America is and is supposed to be and what it strives to be, etc. I think it's a much more important part of the job of president than is often understood by people. And Nixon is, I think, being correctly criticized for not doing it or not doing it well. Tim Weiner, who wrote a recent biography of Nixon, says Nixon led the United States through a time of unbearable turmoil. Keep in mind, Nixon got elected in 1968 after President Johnson, shockingly, as we already know, announced that he would not run for a second term as president in 1968, leaving the presidency wide open from somebody new from either party, and Nixon won, the Republican nominee. But 1968 was at the height of the Vietnam War and the height of the controversy in the United States, anti-Vietnam War protests going on all over the place. The Democratic National Convention of 68 was virtual chaos with all kinds of protesting and clashes between protesters and police outside of the convention. So he became president at a time when America seemed becoming unglued. So that's what unbearable turmoil is referring to. He made war in pursuit of peace. He committed crimes in the name of the law. He tore the country apart while trying to unite it. He sabotaged his presidency by violating the Constitution. He destroyed himself and damaged the nation through deliberate acts of folly. And that might be stating it even somewhat lightly. So what did he do? Well, he carried on the Vietnam War while drawing down the U.S. troop presence in Vietnam, what became known as Vietnamization of the war. So he started drawing American troops out of the war, but continued to fight it sort of by other means. For instance, bombing of Hanoi, the North Vietnamese communist capital, was stepped up. Bombing into Cambodia and Laos was stepped up, sometimes secretly on the part of the government. So just because U.S. troops were coming home more and more, less troops on the ground in Vietnam, which can be seen, of course, as a good thing, but doesn't necessarily mean the war as a whole was less violent, and that Nixon was, coming in and saying, "Hey, this thing has been too violent for too long. Let's draw down in Vietnam." So it can be a little misleading, but it's mainly Watergate that's being alluded to in the rest of that quote, which we'll get to soon enough. Nixon was a talented president. He had successes both in foreign and domestic policy. He had a long resume. He'd served in the House, in the Senate. He'd been Dwight Eisenhower's vice president for all 8 years of Eisenhower's time in the White House. So, and he'd lost, as we know, the 1960 election to John F. Kennedy after being the Republican nominee, and then ran for governor of California a couple years later and lost again there. So his career seemed to be basically over, and at least solidly trending downward. And he made one of the greatest comebacks in American political history by running in 1968 and winning. So in '68 and in the follow-up, re-election in 1972, he won big. And the second time around was one of the biggest, maybe was the biggest landslide in American history. Electoral votes 620 to 17 over George McGovern in 1972. So Nixon became famous for the way he got elected and reelected. Part of it being, as you see on the screen, the Southern strategy, which basically meant on the campaign trail anyway, he moved away from civil rights legislation and support of civil rights issues like busing and affirmative action. He didn't really support that on the campaign trail. So the Southern strategy meant that the Republicans, the Nixon campaign, was going to and did play down their commitment to issues of equality, racial equality, and justice for African Americans because they were concerned about not losing the white Southern vote. So the Southern strategy, and this isn't the end of the Southern strategy. It will be used again by Republicans. So one could certainly see this as, and plenty of people do, as a very dishonest and immoral way to get elected and reelected, since it's in a sense ditching African American rights. But one thing that he did in 1968, the first time he got elected president, is sort of make a speech, more than one, but one that's famous on television, in which he said, "Tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support." And I think one of the things that Nixon perceptively, along with his campaign staff, saw and understood is that there were a lot of Americans that were kind of not involved in politics, at least in a vocal way, going to work every day, doing their jobs, not going out and protesting the Vietnam War or protesting this or that, that who he believed and others believed were kind of actually a silent majority, just waiting to vote for a law and order candidate, which Nixon was, compared to the Democratic side during this period, and sort of saying to them, look, you guys, I know you're not being vocal, but I know you're out there, and I'm on your side, and you should be on my side, this, I think, ended up being effective and also, again, perceptive. Nixon actually governed in many ways as president with kind of a liberal domestic policy agenda, which sounds strange. A Republican, we say he was a conservative Republican. Yes, but remember, I also said that Nixon was an opportunist. He wasn't an ideologue. He wasn't a guy that sort of believed in certain principles, kind of deep down. They weren't baked into him. So not an ideological president at all. So Nixon was sort of willing to even entertain liberal, democratic looking policies like affirmative action, which he did support in the end. Environmental programs, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, was created during this time. The Endangered Species Act was as well. Also, OSHA, right, Occupation Safety and Health Administration, concerned for workers' safety at the federal level, and departments to deal with it. He came out eventually in support of the ERA, national government funding for the arts, all things that were normally kind of in the Democrats' sort of liberal playbook, and he, in a way, is sort of beating them to the punch. So did he do this out of great concern for all those issues? Most likely, maybe even certainly not, but support them he did. Sometimes it may not matter if a leader, the reasons that a leader supports something, if in fact they support something that does good for Americans. On the foreign policy front, Nixon relied heavily on this man, Henry Kissinger, who was born in Austria, an immigrant to the United States, but went to Harvard, a PhD in government from Harvard, was a Harvard professor, and was sort of on a fast track into the policy world, moving over from academia to politics and diplomacy or foreign policy. He's not the only person in U.S. history to have done this, but by the way, so he's one of maybe the most successful of all of them. He originally was Nixon's national security advisor, which was an extremely powerful position by this time. And then he was moved even higher, promoted to Secretary of State for Nixon. And so the two of them together in tandem were quite a solid and gifted team. Nixon understood world politics and diplomacy extremely well himself, but kind of the guru behind the scenes, not totally behind the scenes. He was a pretty out front Secretary of State, but not as out in front as Nixon. Together, they actually achieved quite a bit, though it is controversial. Kissinger, according to Michael Lind, argued that the bipolar world had been replaced by a multipolar world in which the U.S. should pursue realist policies to maximize its own strategic interests. Kissinger had studied the diplomacy and politics between European nations in the 19th century, where there was a multipolar system in place. Remember, we covered these terms before in dealing with the early Cold War. A bipolar world, a bipolar geopolitical system, is when there are two major powers that stand head and shoulders above the rest, which is quite a different configuration than a multipolar world where there are several major powers, not just two or one. They're kind of all in the same ballpark in terms of power, wealth, at the top of the heap. Now, he's saying with the rise of China and the resurgence of Europe by the 1970s, that it's not sort of bipolar any longer. It's not just it had been bipolar before World War II, but the two superpowers coming out of World War II, the U.S. and the Soviets, made it bipolar. He's saying, no, we need to think of this more as a multipolar world once again, the stuff that he had studied in Europe in the 19th century, and that foreign policy should be realist. It shouldn't be based on principle so much. The Cold War had been fought by Truman, Eisenhower, to some degree on principle, meaning we oppose the Soviet Union because what they're doing is morally wrong. They're not committed to, and in fact actively fight against freedom and equality and democratic principles and rule of law, most of which was true. But these guys are saying that doesn't make sense. It's not as practical to have your foreign policy based on morality, and that you can't sort of get along with somebody or get what you want out of them, make some sort of deal with them just because you disapprove of sort of what they do, their policies from a moral perspective. So a realist foreign policy sort of tries to get rid of the sort of the moral aspects. It becomes amoral, not immoral. James Patterson saying, rejecting what he considered excessively moralistic approaches to foreign policy, the wise and realistic architect of foreign policy must not try to change the internal systems of other nations. He must not be sentimental. He must accept limits and work with them. Kissinger hoped to promote a manageable relationship among the U.S., the USSR, Soviets, and the People's Republic of China, as well as a balance of power in the non-communist world among the U.S., Western Europe, and Japan. With the big powers in place, the rest of the world could be stabilized, at least according to Kissinger and his sort of master plan. And the way that they were, the plan, the strategy here is often referred to as détente. This was the biggest part of detente was kind of opening up and trying to normalize relations with the two big communist countries in the world, Maoist China on the left, and the Soviet Union, Russia on the upper left and bottom left. That's Mao in the upper left. Nixon was the first president to go to and visit communist China. And this was sort of a deliberate attempt to send a message that we're not going to play the Cold War by sort of the old formula of waving our judgmental finger at the communist countries. We need to get beyond that. It's not our business anyway, and see if we can work with them. And again, there's some merit to what's what they were doing here. So, as George Herring, one of the great experts on the history of American foreign policy, says, Nixon and Kissinger deserve full credit for their important achievements. The politician and the professor had a keen grasp of the way the world was changing and a shrewd sense in terms of great power politics of how to adapt, developing crude guidelines for cooperation with the Soviet Union and completing major strategic arms and trade agreements with them. The opening to China was long overdue and inevitable, but Nixon and Kissinger seized the moment to start the process and carried it off with consummate diplomatic skill. Herring, by the way, in other passages in the same book, isn't quite as complimentary. So he sees that there were ups and downs to this. So it's not quite, even he doesn't quite, give them, too much credit, because it's been controversial ever since. There are still scholars today that believe that American foreign policy must have some elements of moral concern to it. It must stand for certain principles and values for it to be meaningful, given America's history, given what America has stood for in the world, at least in theory, at least in principle, if not always in action. Nonetheless, there are other scholars who think this sort of realist approach, détente, to foreign policy in the Cold War was a breath of fresh air and much needed. It didn't last too long after this guy was gone, by the way. President Reagan, who we're going to get to, was more of a ideological and moral conservative when it came to foreign policy, so it kind of went out the window pretty quickly. Nixon ruined himself for the most part, the arrogance of power, and he certainly was arrogant and quite insecure, quite vindictive in office and out. But that's actually the title of a book, The Arrogance of Power, biography of Nixon, one of many, not the one I already quoted. And it's the Watergate scandal that proved the unmaking of a president. Rourke says the expansion of executive powers, often called the imperial presidency, weakened the traditional checks and balances on the executive branch and opened the door to abuses. No president, however, had dared go as far as Nixon, who saw opposition as a personal attack and was willing to violate the Constitution to stop it. And so Nixon abused his power again and again, broke the law on multiple occasions, which was proven, and was the target of an impeachment, which he surely would have. He would have been the first president removed from office, almost for sure, except that he actually resigned before it got that far. But the impeachment proceedings were already well underway and close to reaching, their what appears to be inevitable end. All the President's Men, title of a great book by the two lead investigators for the Washington Post, that basically broke the Watergate story and wrote a book that was made into a movie with Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, which is well worth watching. And this became sort of, at the time, the biggest scandal in presidential history. All the President's Men is a reference to all of his cabinets and advisors, mainly advisors. On the left, you see two time covers of John Dean, the President's White House counsel, lawyer, who was right in the center of this. And as it says at the bottom, Dean was the first member of the inner circle to accuse Nixon of actual involvement in Watergate and the cover-up in the press afterwards. So Dean eventually sort of talked, and he was the first one to talk after Nixon had already been denying. You see the headline there. He said, "I've never profited from public service. I've never obstructed justice, and I'm not a crook." That's kind of how Nixon talked. He had these kind of jowls when he sort of shook his head. They kind of shook themselves, whatever. I'm not a crook. So it's fun to kind of watch footage of that, even though I'm not trying to make light of these issues because they're of enormous importance and severity. The Watergate break-in started all this. That's the Watergate Hotel right there. It had been used for all kinds of different things in the past, politically, as well as for other purposes as well. One time, congressional aides, assistants to congressmen, were housed and lived there, at least when they were first in Washington. But in 1972, it was where the Democratic National Headquarters was located. And again, reading my own words, in June 1972, 5 men working for Nixon's re-election campaign, which, by the way, was called CREEP. Not kidding. CREEP. The committee, that's the acronym. The Committee to Re-elect the President. CREEP. So they broke into the Democratic Party headquarters, so 5 guys at the Watergate complex, which you see there, to repair bugging devices they had already installed and were reported and arrested. Evidence was found on some of them, linking them to the administration. Nixon and other officials claimed no knowledge of any of this, starting a long-term cover-up that started the wheels in motion to what would become the biggest scandal in presidential history. So these 5 burglars, by the way, the campaign, re-election campaign, CREEP, was sort of the overall group, but within Nixon's inner circle, the guys that sort of did the dirty work, the actual breaking in and all kinds of other illegal activities, were known from the nickname the burglars, referred to as they were burglars, the plumbers. I'm saying the plumbers. So these guys would go in and fix the plumbing. A euphemism for bugging and doing whatever else, other shenanigans that they were up to. I'm skipping a lot here, of course, but this did eventually lead, within less than 2 years, almost 2 years, the resignation of President Nixon. The Watergate investigations that led to all kinds of evidence of foul play on the part of the Nixon administration, violating the Constitution and violating the law, both led an increasing number of Americans, not all, and an increasing number of congressmen to turn against him. The key was when Nixon, again, denied, but it was found out that Nixon had always, as president, secretly kept recordings of anybody that came into the Oval Office to speak with him. You'd think that's idiotic, but and it might have been. But Nixon was somewhat paranoid about people double-crossing him, and he probably thought it was sort of good info to have, and intel on other people, evidence. I could bring this back out and say, hey, you said this, and I'll go public with it if you don't do what I want. But it backfired on him, of course, when it became public after the initial Watergate break-in became known, and he was ordered by the courts to hand over the tapes, and he stalled and hemmed and hawed and eventually turned them over. And they were damning enough in what that was on there. So it verified a number of allegations of foul play, corruption, illegality on the part of his administration. But it even brought to light some things that hadn't come out yet. And there were some notorious blank spaces on the tapes when they were turned over, big blank spots. And we don't know what was in them, of course, to this day. But if the stuff that they did turn over was bad enough, You wonder what they decided to erase and what that may have done or said. So this is not exactly the most shining moment for the latest glory in the presidency's history, with Nixon in up to his over his head. In the end, a handful of congressmen, a handful of Republican senators from his own party went to the White House and basically said, you have to resign, or we have no choice but to vote against you, in an impeachment hearing or an impeachment trial in the Senate. And if the Republicans in the Senate voted to have him convicted and removed from office, the Democrats were, of course, already there. So he resigned, I think it was later that day or the next day after they did that. So, and this was because some Republican senators probably felt it was a matter of conscience, right and wrong, but many of them, or most of them, were, I think, led to this viewpoint, this stance, mainly because of political pressure and fear that they're going to be ousted from office by their own constituents at home, because there was, again, growing outrage over Nixon, even within Republican ranks amongst the citizenry. Which brings us briefly to Gerald R. Ford, Nixon's vice president. An easy guy, president to overlook, but and I don't think he necessarily should be overlooked. He didn't win the presidency outright when he ran for election in his own right in 1976. He lost to the Democratic nominee Jimmy Carter, who of course became the president. So, but Ford had a distinguished career in Congress for many, many years before this, and again served as vice president to Nixon and then as president without being elected himself. But those presidents, I think there have been 4 of them that never were actually elected. They tend to get totally passed over, and in Ford's case, I think it is a mistake, partly for the most controversial thing that he did, which you see here. So Stephen Knott, I've quoted already, says Gerald Ford deserves more credit than he receives for stabilizing the nation after the long nightmare of the Nixon presidency came to an end. His pardon of Nixon a month after assuming the presidency cost him dearly in the public opinion polls, but was nevertheless a courageous act designed to end the nation's focus on the Watergate scandal. Why would that be courageous for him to do that? He pardons his old boss when it was clear that his boss was had been committing all kinds of unconstitutional acts and illegal acts. How is it courageous to pardon him? Well, partly because by pardoning him, he knew ahead of time that he would be courting unpopularity, that it would possibly ruin, if not damage, his, maybe just damage his chances at being elected in his own right. But he did it anyway. And the other side, the Democrats, liberals, leftists, have always, from that period forward, believed that this was another corrupt act on the part of the Republicans, that he was just sort of bailing out his friend and buddy. But I don't think that's true. I think you can make a good argument on both sides of whether or not he should have pardoned him or not. But I don't think it was done with kind of any kind of agreement between friends or sort of as a corrupt bargain. Nonetheless, it may have cost Ford a chance at the presidency, at least in terms of being elected and serving out a full term. Knott goes on to say Gerald Ford proved that a chief executive can defend the office of the presidency and not be a demagogue, and that a strong president does not have to pander to public opinion. This is where I think he can be overlooked, unfortunately, because he was, in many ways, a very honorable president. Not be a demagogue, I won't define demagogue here, but I'll just simplify this. The author here is saying that he didn't have to be kind of in the public eye. He didn't have to sort of take center stage. Didn't have to be a rock star like President Kennedy kind of had become, and many of our presidents since have felt, I've got to become sort of an extremely popular rock star, be out there, be charming, have the public adore you as much as possible, etc., etc. He was more of a behind-the-scenes guy that kind of did his job, brought his lunch pail to work with him, not literally, and to sort of did a blue-collar version of the presidency, and he didn't feel the need to pander to public opinion, to do sort of everything with regard to how's this going to affect my popularity. The pardon, of course, being the number one case in point there. But I actually think presidents who stick to this, it's a more limited sort of view of the presidency. The president himself having to believe that no, my job is a more limited one. It's a more circumscribed one, and I'm not going to sort of go further than that. And at this time, that was probably needed after a president who really was sort of making himself, or had made himself, kind of a rock star, but then got headlines for all the wrong reasons along with that. So just kind of a solid, in a sense, caretaker, as we mentioned about previous presidents here, was probably what the doctor ordered. So now we move to the 1980s, major social issues of the 80s, and I've just picked out a few.